One thing I'm always impressed by is if you look at NC Wyeth's life's work, it has such enormous range, from illustrations to advertisements to murals to independent paintings that he did. His sensitivity to life around him is quite explicit. He was a poet as well as an amazing visual spokesperson.
This is the NC Wyeth studio. This was the space where he created the characters and the settings for those characters for all of his illustrations. This was where he put the paint on the canvas. NC Wyeth grew up in Needham, Massachusetts. And at that time, Needham was a fairly rural place to live. He was very much an artist early in life. He drew constantly. He went to Mechanic Art School in Boston and then Massachusetts Normal Art School. At that point, a couple of teachers identified his talent as perhaps something that would lend itself to illustration. He learned that the Howard Pyle School was the place to go to study illustration.
NC Wyeth moved to this area in order to study with Howard Pyle, who had a summer school in Chadds Ford up near the Brandywine Valley. Howard Pyle was known as the father of American illustration. People say his best student was NC Wyeth. Howard Pyle instilled in all his students a number of things that show up all through the Wyeths, and one of them is the Brandywine Valley. Just scrape the earth and you find the battlefields and you find the blood and you find the soldiers and the powders on their trousers from the Revolution.
I don't believe any man who ever painted a great big picture did so by wandering from one place to another searching for interesting material. By the gods, there's almost an inexhaustible supply of subjects right around my back door, meager as it is. I have come to the full conclusion that a man can only paint that which he knows even more than intimately. He's got to know it spiritually. And to do that, he's got to live around it, in it, and be a part of it.
Pyle also felt it was very important for students to project themselves into whatever they were illustrating. And he encouraged students to not only choose a specialty, but also to go off and live their specialty. For NC Wyeth, he had a rather boyish enthusiasm for the West, and as a young man decided the West would be his specialty. He set off for the West in 1904. He spent a couple of weeks on a ranch. He spent some time on reservations where he interacted with Native Americans. NC Wyeth adopted the trappings of the West and really styled himself a cowboy. Once he returned, he used that to churn out canvas after canvas of very exciting Western scenes. Many of the Pyle students started out by visiting the art departments of various magazines in New York City. So you would have to actually bring your canvases from Wilmington. That would mean hopping a train and making appointments with the various art editors. A number of art departments published a couple of Wyeth series of Western works and very quickly became very famous as a Western artist. By 1907, Outing magazine was touting Wyeth as one of the greatest depictors of American outdoor life.
He was successful, he made money, and life, I think, just propelled him forward without him having too much time to think about what kind of a career he wanted.
As a student in Wilmington, NC Wyeth met Carolyn Bacchius. She was very supportive of NC Wyeth's career, and I think that's one of the things that drew him to her. He courted her by bringing her out to the Brandywine. NC Wyeth was struck by this area.
Among those misty gray hills of Chadds Ford, along the stretches of those succulent meadows with their peaceful cattle and those big sad trees and the quaint and humble stone farmhouses tucked underneath them, there is that spirit which exactly appeals to the deepest appreciation of my soul. To me, it is all like wonderfully soft and liquid music.
By 1908, NC Wyeth and Carolyn were married, and they had decided that this would be where they would raise their family.
He was born in an era that really liked paintings of local landscapes. So he painted the local landscapes of Chadds Ford when he went to Maine, where he spent the summers with his family. He painted the local seascapes of Maine and the island cultures that he was a part of there. The way farmers sowed their crops, or the way fishermen laid out their lobster traps or brought in their herring, became fodder for fine art canvases.
NC Wyeth built this studio, which is literally 25 steps away from the house.
I can just imagine what a magical place this must have been as a little kid, to be running around in these spaces and to be able to see what Daddy was painting, because he often painted very large-scale works of figures that were larger than life. It was what we call the golden age of illustration when he worked, the late 19th century up to World War I. And if you were good at it, then the commissions would come rolling in.
In 1911, Scribner's editor Joseph Chapin was looking for someone to illustrate Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. And this opportunity to actually dig into Stevenson's fabulous story absolutely set his imagination on fire. NC Wyeth decided that he would go with these huge canvases that are almost 4 feet high. There was no reason for publication that they had to be this big. And I think it's sort of indicative of the energy that he wanted to put into each of these images. They were an absolute sensation. And for the next decade, he churned out these Scribner's books, all the classics, Robinson Crusoe, Boy's King Arthur, and he became known as a classic illustrator.
One of the things NC Wyeth was very good at was choosing the moment in a text that he wanted to illustrate. And usually that moment was a dramatic one. Wyeth was very good at understanding what grabs the reader. He just thrust you into the middle of action, and you felt like you were in the middle of the battle.
Early on, Wyeth was caught up in the excitement of becoming an illustrator. But as time went on, he realized this ball had been rolling too quickly. Wyeth's career is more or less framed by the question, is it art or is it illustration? In the first half of the 20th century, that was a distinction that almost everyone in the art business, shall we say, made. You were a painter or you were an illustrator. And it was a distinction that mattered especially to NC Wyeth as his career progressed.
I want to be a painter. I respect illustration, but I realize keener than ever before the terrible rut I'm in. A dangerous one, too. I shall continue illustrating by all means. That has its commercial value, my bread and butter. But I want to be able to paint a picture. And this is as far from the realms of illustration as black is from white. I want to paint a picture with nothing but a soul.
He yearned to have time alone in his studio, making easel paintings that he hoped he could sell in the usual settings of galleries or group exhibitions and be known as a fine artist. And unfortunately, he could never give his full time to that because the way he was making his living was pretty demanding. And so he was a man that was torn between these two fields.
It was important for him to have a family. He kept having children, and he needed to support that family, and he could do that very well with illustration. Being a pure painter was a little bit more of a risk, and he certainly wasn't ready to become a starving artist in a garret.
I think today we have a much broader understanding of NC Wyeth. He has a reputation today he didn't really enjoy seeing in his own lifetime. Today, illustration has become a very noble subject to understand as an important part of American visual culture. We have good histories of illustration, and he's always one of the giants.
Today, we stand in front of the Treasure Island paintings, for example, and realize that that is amazing painting. This exhibition was designed to show the full depth of NC Wyeth's work. We see him as an illustrator, we see him as a muralist, we see him doing advertising work, we see him as a fine artist. And I think put that all together, we realize that he was an artist, period.